Well, I want to invite everybody, if you would. Uh-oh, did I lose my feed? Oh, I think I'm still streaming. I invite you all to get your Bibles out. Let's go together to the book of Numbers, chapter 22. Numbers, chapter 22. To our audience on chat, if you can throw something into the chat and let me know if it's working. I'm having a little bit of a problem. It's kind of a strange thing. Okay, there it is. It just popped up finally. Okay. So for some reason I couldn't get it to show. But for the audience, the live studio audience, we would say, get your Bibles out. Let's go over to Numbers chapter 22. Tonight we're starting kind of a two-parter that Lamar is going to pick up for us next week. Just a reminder, I'll be gone next week. That means this Sunday night we actually aren't having a class. I'd actually thought, well, what if I could pull it off online down in California, but I don't think we're going to be able to. So there's no class this coming Sunday, and Wednesday next week we won't have it online. We'll just be in person for next week. So actually for the next 2 Wednesdays. So that'll be the case as we kind of organize that while I'm away. So. We are, though, in Numbers chapter 22, beginning a story that's a two-parter because part 2 will be next week. It introduces us to some really important people that are talked about in the New Testament, people we need to know about because they're referenced in the New Testament from a doctrinal perspective of matters of doctrine we have to understand. So it's an important lesson. It's one to think about as we're going to be moving into those things tonight. Before we get started, though, let's have a word of prayer. Would you bow your heads and would you pray with me? Holy God and Father in heaven, we love you and we thank you for the blessing of this day and this hour that we can come together and spend a few moments in study of your word. We pray, Father, as we consider the story of Balaam and Balak, we learn from this moment how important it is that we speak your truth and that we speak only your truth, and how important it is that we are not drawn aside or tempted to do the wrong thing. Father, be with us in this week. Watch over those who have been sick, Father, and in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Numbers chapter 22. Children of Israel moved and camped in the plains of Moab on the side of the Jordan across from Jericho. Now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was exceedingly afraid of the people because they were many, and Moab was sick with dread because of the children of Israel. So Moab said to the elders of Midian, now this company will lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. Introducing a man named Balak, a king of the land of Moab. We're going to talk a little bit about Moab. One of the questions I hope you can answer for me is who are the Moabites? That's something we'll come back to here in just a couple of moments. It's kind of interesting, by the way, and a little confusing that Moab and Midian are going to work on these things together. I'm going to talk a little bit about Midian too. Moab and Midian are going to work on these things together, and in fact, they kind of get used interchangeably for the next 4 or 5 chapters. So don't let that confuse you. They are distinct people, but for the purpose of what's going to happen now, they really are kind of one and the same as they're being brought together. I like maps. I like to be able to see what things look like. And here's an example of what it is that we're seeing and talking about now. This black line represents the Israelites as they traveled. And remember last week we said they had to go around Edom, and that made them very discouraged. 2 weeks ago we learned that Edomites hadn't allowed them to come through. So they had to go all the way around Edom. It really discouraged them. It led to some of their complaining that got them in trouble. Now they've come through and they have parked, so to speak, on the other side of the river from the city of Jordan, city of Jericho, the river Jordan, city of Jericho. This is going to be their entrance area. So they're lining up. This is the end run, so to speak, for them to move in and take possession of the land. We're gearing up. We're within the last final months of things. And I don't know, maybe Lamar will say differently, but I'd say their biggest mistake, though, is still on the horizon as what's going to happen next week. But they're coming in here, and they've come around to the area right up against the land of Moab, the kingdom of Moab. Now, the Moabites have been watching things for a while. In fact, what we might want is they've been watching things for 40 years. And how are the Moabites behaving to all these things? This is really descriptive, by the way. What did it say? Yeah, they're sick with dread. You know, it's interesting. In Joshua, we're probably going to pick up in Joshua for the next quarter. In Joshua, we read about the people in Jericho saying things like, you know, we can't even stand up, so weak in the knees, in fear of the Israelites. There was this huge group of people. But by the way, just think about this for a second. Why would a huge group of people be such a terrifying thing? Why is that such an unusual thing to see? What do you think, Gregor?
Well, at this time, we didn't have, there is no infrastructure that brings food from far away.
That's it, yeah.
It is whatever you have in the land. And when you have 1 million people come through, you assume the land is picked clean.
Yeah.
Now, we do have a slight difference where God has been taking care of them for 40 years.
Yeah.
And then that's something I found interesting, is that they assume they're going to lick up the land, but as far as I can tell, they haven't been licking up land anywhere.
But what's really incredible, and Gregor, you hit it on the head, is this is probably something nobody's ever seen in history, and probably never will again. 2 million people moving through a desolate, dead land and showing up on your doorstep. Probably the one place where you never thought you'd see 2 million people show up, because, you know, there's 2 people that direction, not 2 million. And now 2 million people come in and they're right there, and that would scare you to death, especially if you've already known that they have been pretty powerful. You know, Grant makes a point here. He says, you know, the Israelites did take all the wealth from the last nation they were at. So, you know, that's a bad sign if they show up at your doorstep, having taken everything of value from Egypt. That would give you some sense of fear. By the way, this was prophetic. This was something that way back 40 years before, God had said this is going to happen in Exodus 15 and verse 15. He said, the chiefs of Edom will be dismayed, the mighty men of Moab, trembling, will take hold of them, and all the inhabitants of Canaan will melt away. And by the way, this is important because this was part of the conquest promise. In other words, how are we going to conquer these great people? What is God saying is going to happen? Yeah, they're going to be terrified of you. They're not going to have the will to fight you. You know, they're going to be so terrified of you that overwhelming them isn't going to be a problem. And so these things are being fulfilled. So as they're moving along, these nations are terrified. They're frightened of them. That this is important to understand, that this is a fulfillment of these things. So Balak is thinking to himself, and what does he think isn't going to work? You know, as he says, hey, look at the people that come out of Egypt, and they're settling next to me. Verse 7 says, I almost think it's a little funny because, you know, the ultimate worst neighbor is his imagination here. You know, here they are, they showed up at camp next to me. And what does he decide won't work? I know you have to kind of read around that to get this, but what is the idea that won't work? That's been tried before already and failed. Fighting, yeah. So in other words, he's smart enough to say, you know what? It doesn't work to fight these people because they've been fighting everybody and they seem to win every battle. They seem to do great. They're well fed. They're strong people. So, you know, we're not going to win. So he comes up with this scheme, I'll say. This scheme is, instead of fighting them, what I'm going to do, I called it spiritual warfare. Not like the Bible describes it, but, you know, that maybe is the best way to describe it. He says, I'm going to send a letter to someone. I'm going to have a prophet come, and I'm going to have him curse this people for me. I'll pay him a lot of money to do it. And he's going to bring out a curse. That's the big plan. And it's interesting because, you know, like I said, I give it to Moab for at least thinking, you know, fighting them isn't going to work. But what if we can spiritually fight them? What if we can stop their blessings? You know, the conversations later on, not here, but elsewhere, describe the idea that they had a sense, they knew that there was a powerful God behind these people. So their thinking is, that's what we need to think about. Well, that's, like I said, it's not a bad way of thinking because you're right. You can't defeat them physically. So I think that that really is a remarkable thing. Got some questions for you to think about here. Let's tell me about this. Where the Moabites come from, first of all. The nation of the Moabites, where did they come from? Monique? They are descendants of Lot. Monique, I'll give you an extra credit point if you can tell me what the other nation that's descended from Lot is. Very good, very good. The Ammonites are the other people. And Moab and Ammon sit right next to each other, and they do a lot of stuff together. So they were brother nations, I guess you might say. So they're both descended from Lot. Here's another tough question. We also talked about Midian. Who are the Midianites, or who are they descended from? You got it? Ishmael. They're descendants of Ishmael, or one of so Abraham had a son named Midian, but the Ishmaelites get called the Midianites. So it's always a little bit, they're either his descendants or, so they're descendants of Abraham for sure. So the Midianites basically are the precursors to what we call today the Arab peoples. So the Midianites are these people that have lived out in the desert, a little bit south and a little bit to the east of where the Moabites are. But they have a kinship, but just kind of like Israel has a kinship too. Now, here's a question to kind of think about for a moment. Should they have been afraid of them? Should the Moabites have said, boy, this is the end for us? Ron, what do you got?
Probably not, especially the Midianites. Some of them got along with Moses really well.
Okay. You said it. I was going to say, don't say it yet, because I'll ask you a question, but I'll come back to that here in a second. But yes, very good. Midianites especially didn't really have anything to fear.
I was going to say yes, because they didn't necessarily know about the proclamation of death in Deuteronomy 2, where they really didn't have, they didn't have any fear even though they would.
Stephen's comment is really good. Stephen, if you heard what Stephen said, he said maybe they wouldn't know what Deuteronomy, the words in Deuteronomy where God had said you're not to harass the Moabites, this statement that God had made. And Stephen, I really hadn't thought too much about that because Deuteronomy actually hadn't been written yet. Deuteronomy is several months away from being spoken and written. So, that statement of, don't harass the Moabites, that's very interesting, Stephen, that maybe that was just something the Israelites knew. Lisa kind of makes a statement that, if they're against them, they should be afraid. So that really makes sense as well. Go ahead.
Well, but God did promise Lot. And he didn't just, the promise wasn't made to empty air. At some point, Lot was informed that he would have a nation as well.
Kind of interesting. The Midianites had that sense too of a promised inheritance as well. So it is kind of interesting.
They weren't faithful. They had high places.
Yes, yeah.
And there's all kinds of indications. Or Moab or Balak had no clue what was going on as we get through the story. But,
that's actually important, Gregor. I was going to say one of the things about the Moabites, just like you said there, is that it's pretty clear they have no real knowledge of God. In fact, one of the next question. Do we get that? Next question. Why did they summon him? Kind of relates to that point that you said that. So why would they summon Balaam? And by the way, where was Balaam from? You remember what it said? It said he's from the river. But yeah, the Euphrates River. So if you looked on a map, the map I showed you, the Euphrates wasn't even on it because it's way up north. It's north of Damascus. You go way up there. So this is what's interesting to me, is that Balak says, hey, we got to get a guy. I know the guy. They're not just going to run down the street and get this guy. They're going to take a journey that probably took a month. They had to go all the way there. Then go all the way up to past Damascus, way up north the Euphrates River, talk to Balaam. By the way, what happened the first time? Well, we haven't got there yet, but just think about the fact that maybe they had to do this more than once. So why? Why Balaam and not some of their own priests or prophets?
Well, Balaam's reputation preceded him in the fact that, and Moab knew that. In the invitation, he indicates that, if you curse somebody, they are cursed. If you bless somebody, they are blessed. So it was, in Moab's brain, Balaam was powerful.
Okay.
So we learn later that it wasn't Balaam that was powerful. It was God, of course. But
So Gregor's first point, really important. Balaam has a reputation as a powerful God. as a powerful spiritual man. Stephen?
I was just going to say that they probably had already tried to priest anyway.
Okay. One of the things that Stephen suggested, maybe they've already tried their priests, and that's not doing any good. One of the things to think about is that their priests, as we kind of infer, are priests or prophets of Baal, which are pretty ineffective. One of the interesting things about Balaam is that as you kind of go through the text here, he has a connection to God. I'm going to be careful about this because he's not a godly guy, but there's several times where he's spoken of as a prophet of Jehovah. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. Balaam has a reputation, but Balaam might also have a connection with the very God of the Israelites. And that might also be something about this. So now, Ryan, I'm going to put it back to you. Do we know any of the Midianite priests or prophets? And Ryan says yes. Who was it? Jethro. Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot. Jethro has another name in the Old Testament. Oh, I'll feel good if you didn't get it right. See, that's a terrible thing to say. I'll feel good if you didn't get it. Anybody remember? His other name was Reuel. And you know what's kind of interesting about that name is that sometimes it's a little confusing if Reuel is Jethro or maybe even Jethro's son, by the way, sometimes it reads. But Jethro was a high priest of Midian. But what's interesting about Jethro as a high priest of Midian is he's a high priest of Jehovah, being a high priest of Midian. So, you know, that's kind of an interesting thing. But, you know, I would think of it like this. The high priest of Midian isn't like the high priest of Israel, where that's the only priest. There might have been lots of priests. So being the high priest of Jehovah in Midian might have just, in his country, just made him one of many. So, you know, it wouldn't necessarily have the same impact of saying you were the high priest of Israel. And that might be why we're having conversations like this right now, where the Midianites, and your first thought is, why would they be in a panic? You know, because, you know, Moses is practically a Midianite. He lived with the Midianites as long as he lived with the Israelites, as far as the first part of his life went. But, you know, this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. One more question about the Moabites. There's a famous Moabite that was an ancestor of Jesus. You got it, Ryan?
I'm thinking about maybe their society was all harsh. We had very few people who were of Jehovah and a whole lot of people who were more paganistic.
So Ryan, that's exactly what I think. Now, by the way, that probably is where Israel there were probably more pagan Israelites than there were God-fearing Israelites. Well, we know that for a fact by the time of Ahab, whenever we're told there's only 7,000 by that time. So that's probably, if it's true of Israel, I would guess, Ryan, you're exactly right. It would probably almost certainly be true of Midian, where, you know, being a high priest of Midian might not mean he, you know, had very many people that feared God. So that's a good point. Monique, do you have your hand up for the next one? It is Ruth. It is Ruth. Now, Moabites are going to get in trouble here, and God is going to make a declaration through the book of Deuteronomy that no Moabite would enter into the assembly of Israel until up to the 10th generation. Ruth is a pretty spectacular exception to that, and it's a great story. But the point is, Ruth is a Moabite, and it's just something worth knowing at this time. By the way, when Ruth takes place, isn't that long after the Israelites had entered the land? So get a sense that whenever Naomi in the beginning of Ruth went into Moab, this would be in a time where maybe some of the people in Moab could remember these events. It's, you know, it's not unlikely that that's the case. It's kind of powerful. Teresa too, she got Ruth as well. So let's keep going. Let's keep going. So the idea is we're going to go find Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river. We don't know where Pethor is, but near the river, near the Euphrates. And so they go to seek out this man. And we already talked about this. Why him? Because he's some guy of renown. Now, this is something I think is really neat. I don't remember how long ago, I think in the 1960s, archaeologists are digging up a building in Israel or Jordan, I don't remember which, and a real ancient building, and they find a wall that has fallen over, and as they're picking up the wall, there's writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall, and it's pretty good sized writing on the wall, it titles itself the story of Balaam. It's this Balaam. It actually gives his name and his father's name and his location. And it's this Balaam, and it kind of talks about how he had come and, you know, done some, you know, stuff for people, and we're talking about these things. It's just a really neat little tidbit, not inspired, to be clear. It's not even part of this story. It's telling a different story. It might not have even been a real thing. But the point was that Balaam had enough of a reputation that he's even known outside of the Bible. So I guess he's Joel Osteen. He's kind of a superstar. He's just somebody that everybody's heard of. So it really just kind of gives us this sense of somebody powerful. You could reach out, you could get this guy. This is the guy to get. And that's just a really interesting thing to grab about Balaam. That Balaam is the guy that if you want to invoke the God's wrath from that pagan perspective, he's the guy you talk to. So they send their people up there. Now, what does Balaam say when they show up? This is kind of interesting. Balaam say, they come up and they say, hey, we want you to do this. And Balaam says, of course I will. No, what does he say? Rob, you remember what he says?
He said, you guys, let's sleep on it, and I'll tell you in the morning after the Lord talks.
So interestingly enough, and by the way, he uses that word Jehovah. I'm going to go to, let's rest and let's see if Jehovah talks to me tonight. Just a really neat thing. I'll tell you what, maybe for the sake of time, we won't go too far into it. Just the idea that this was how God talked to him through dreams. That's such an interesting thing to consider how that happens a lot of times in the Bible, particularly people that weren't in a close relationship with God. If God spoke to them, it was usually through a dream. So it must have happened before, at least enough that he knew this is the way that Jehovah talks to him. Jehovah talks to him, and what does God say to him? He says, don't go. Don't go. It's kind of interesting because God in the dream, who are they? Balaam tells him, he says, you don't go with them. So Balaam, next day, says, sorry, the Lord, I like the way he says it. The Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you. And Lisa makes a statement. He had to talk to God. And God said, these people he's talking about, they're blessed. They're blessed. And so that's that. So the people in Moab go all the way back down to Moab. Get another month. I don't know. Like I said, I'm just speculating amount of time. Month is probably about right. They tell Balak, and Balak, no. So he says, okay, let's get more money and more princes of Moab to go up there. And he says, whatever you want, more or less. He says, let nothing hinder you coming. So they go all the way back up. They go to Balaam a second time. Now Balaam, I always thought this is interesting about Balaam. Balaam is a very complex person to me. This is the reality of the Bible. Nobody's two-dimensional. These are real people. Balaam's a real person, and Balaam's processes are, you really can't go against God. He says, you could give me a house full of silver and gold. I can't go beyond the word of the Lord my God. Again, this is the thing about Balaam that I just think is so interesting. What did he just say about Jehovah?
He's my God.
He's my God. So I just want you to let that sink in again about the identity of Balaam. So Balaam says, you stay here. We'll let the Lord say what he's going to say. Now this time, what happens? And Teresa says it can't go beyond the word of God. I find that, remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, don't think beyond the word of God. Don't think beyond what is written. And Balaam was saying that. Second time God talks to him, what does God say? Does he say no? Second time, verse 20. He says, you go, but...
That was confusing because I think that...
You know what it is? The guy that wrote that handout had a weird worded question where he said something like the third time, So if you're wondering about this must be the third time, the guy that wrote that handout, I don't know, he probably had, hit his head or something. So he did. It was noticed that he had written that the third time, and he was hoping that if he put the question up here corrected, nobody would catch that was the case. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for catching that mistake. So this time, what does God say though? So Lisa says, God says, go with them, but only say what I'm going to tell you to say. Now,
didn't God say if they come back to you, go with them? That's what I got out of the minute.
The men have come to call you, rise up. And go.
Well, you could be right. I might have missed that.
Because that was, to me, that was the one thing that made it all different, is because God said, if they come to you, go with them.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, Gregor. I didn't even think about the term. So Gregor's in verse 20. If they come to call you, rise, go with them. You know, Gregor, what's interesting, I didn't really think about the idea of there being a conditional point there. I just assumed next day you're going to get up and go with them.
And then Balaam went up and went. And he's there along with his servants. They don't say anything about the princes. So I guess I have the impression that Balaam went on his own, hence God got cranky.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Because, I mean, God's not going to get cranky if he told him to go.
Yeah, Lisa's making that point too. She says, yeah, it's, you know, the idea they come to call. So Gregor, what you're kind of pointing to actually comes back and maybe helps us out here in just a few moments when we want to say, why would God be frustrated about this? That's going to be really good. Lamar?
Saying that this whole exchange that goes on. You know, a lot of people today in their religious world will say they have a special relationship or have some closeness to God who may speak to you, but here he's using someone that clearly isn't a believer, but purpose. He talks to him and he gives him instructions. So
what's really interesting about that, Lamar's, you know, if you heard what Lamar was saying there, that in this circumstance, it's I was talking to somebody who's, you know, like I said, I don't know if I'd say he's not a believer, but I would say he's not a very good believer. Because a couple of things are going to make us think he probably believes in a lot of gods. We're going to see the word sorcery in a few moments. So if he is a believer, he's not very good. Now, what's interesting is, yet God's still going to use him. Now, Lamar, it would almost be funny if, and I say funny, maybe that's not the best word, but it would almost be funny if God, to demonstrate how insignificant that would be, if God were just like to speak through an animal at some point. And to kind of make that feel like maybe the prophet isn't that important, even an animal could speak for God. That would be an interesting way of looking at that. But that's a really interesting point, that here's a guy that's not a godly guy, and yet God's going to use him very specifically in these points. Ryan, go ahead.
Maybe because the old prophet Elijah, the God, or Jonah, sometimes the prophets were deeply flawed.
Yeah, Jonah, the man of God, the older man of God, in 2 Kings 13. Yeah, that is some great illustrations that sometimes even the best of prophets weren't good. You know, we see some pretty flawed prophets throughout the scriptures. It's a great point. Gregor, go ahead.
We also have to remember that we're blessed because we have the whole Word of God. Where back here, even the books of the Bible weren't even quite all written yet. If we had, did we even have Exodus or Numbers at this point? Because this is happening.
Yeah, as it's happening, they wouldn't have it yet. Right.
And we still have a situation where the patriarchs all over the planet are still the closest thing to some sort of religious organization we have. So, the Jews are just, throughout history, the Jews were the chosen of God until Christ came. But before that, even, Jonah being a prime example, there was no chosen of God during the time of Jonah, but yet an entire city was able to repent. So it seems to me that God's always provided some way for his message to get out.
Well, one thing, Gregor, is you kind of point to Jonah there and say, that God uses various ways to get various messages across, is that I think Jonah and Nineveh testified to the idea that it wasn't unheard of for a prophet to show up. We don't have a record of that, but that might have happened a lot more than we think. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Only the Jews, though, had the written message that was actually inspired passed on to them. And that's a really interesting.
Look through history, and when you look at modern history since the New Testament was founded, everything we look at where somebody claims to be a prophet, invariably you can see just by what they taught that is obviously not true.
Yeah, it's a really important point. We'll pick up and kind of run through what for many of us is probably the most interesting part of the story, but kind of inconsequential, other than it just makes a point for us. So as they're moving along, God is angry with them. I'm going to ask why here in a moment. I've already got some good answers here in the chat, but I'm going to hold on them. I think because there's I think all of you have some good points to make out of this too. So we'll come back in a few moments and ask why. But one of the interesting things to think about here is that God's now angry with him, and there's the angel going to destroy him. So the angel's there, and the donkey's doing what?
Saving his life.
Well, saving his life, yeah. What's he doing though?
Talking.
Well, before he's talking, yeah, he's like running into the walls, you know. I used to have, years ago, we had a horse, and she was a rascal. And she'd love to go in the orchard. She'd love to go where the trees were and get under the low branches and just kind of scrape us off, you know. And, why would you, doesn't want to take me. Well, that's kind of what it might have felt like. This donkey's running him up against the wall and everything. And so Balaam's getting really angry. He's hitting it. And then this profound statement, the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey. And she says, what have I done with that you would hit me these 3 times? Now I think, I want to say this. I think the most incredible part of the story isn't just that the donkey talked, but what? Yeah, the Balaam just kind of takes this in stride, you know. Why did you hit me? Well, let me tell you why I hit you, you know. I'm going to tell you exactly. It's a remarkable thing. I don't think this, by the way, is, there was a time where I wondered, well, is it possible what it's describing is just the empathy or something like that? But, we're going to see in a moment, first of all, foremost, it says God loosened the tongue. But when Peter talks about this later, Peter makes it very clear this wasn't, just a matter of empathy or, I always joke about the beagles talking to me about things that, when they whine or stuff like that. But this was genuinely a conversation that's going on between the two. And the donkey says, look, I've done this to you before. And Balaam says, well, no. And then the point is, Balaam then looks up and he sees that there's this angel. And now he knows, the irony is the angel says, why'd you hit your donkey? Your donkey's trying to save your life because I was going to kill you. And Balaam says, I sinned. Now, by the way, that's important because Balaam sinned at this point. And we want to kind of chalk that in our mind to come back to that. Teresa also picks up the idea that it's interesting. He answers without question. That to me is really the remarkable. It's not the most remarkable part of this, but it is a remarkable thing that Balaam just starts right into this. So Balaam and Balak come together now. They meet, and Balaam makes this statement. Balaam says to Balak, look, I've come to you. Now, have I any power to say anything? The word that God puts in my mouth, that's what I must speak. Now, again, Balaam is saying everything a good preacher should say. I'm only going to say what God says. I can't, if God doesn't let me do this, I can't go beyond what God says. That's really some great stuff he's saying. And yet, where's the first place they go? The high place, verse 41, they go to the high places of Baal, which goes back to what Lamar said about Balaam just being a very complex person. A man who clearly doesn't take God too seriously. So the first try, as they go out to the high place, they build up 7 altars. 7 altars. And he gets 7 bulls and 7 rams, and they make this great sacrifice. And here it goes at verse 5, and the Lord puts the word in his mouth, and he goes forth, verse 7, and he begins the story. We won't read it for the sake of time. Just tell me what it is. Give me a 1 or 2 word synopsis of what happens. What does he do?
He says, Israel's great, and you should get over it.
Yeah, Israel's great, in the story. And, it's one of those things you wish you could have seen, right? As Balak's like, what are you doing? Verse 11, why have you done this? You were supposed to curse them. And look what he says. You blessed them bountifully. You just gave them a fantastic blessing. And so Balaam says, look, I've told you this repeatedly. I can't say anything they don't say. He says, okay, so let's try this way. So first blessing comes out. Let's try a different place. So now they go to Mount Pisgah. What's the symbolism? What's the importance of that mountain? Mount Pisgah. Why is that an important mountain? I'll give you a hint. It's a great place if you want to go up and look at all the land, the promised land. Yeah, that's the place where Moses died. Moses went up to Mount Pisgah and died. God took him up there, let him see the whole land. So kind of interesting. That's the second place now they go. So it goes up to this great mountain. Altar, 7 bulls, 7 rams. Same story. A new blessing. It is different, but and by the way, verse 19, you probably should have underlined. It's a profound thing, profound statement about the nature of God. That the point is, here he comes out with this incredible blessing of what God is going to do. Verse 23, though, I just want to make a point. For there is no sorcery against Jacob, nor any divination against Israel. Now, I think that's kind of an important point. And Balak explodes again. Again, it's almost comical. He blows up. He says, well, don't say anything. You know, if you're going to bless them, just don't curse them, don't bless them. And Balaam says it again. I'm telling you. So Balak says, okay, we got one more place to go. The third place is Peor. Now, that's going to be important for what Lamar is going to be talking about next week. They go to Peor. And this time, there's an interesting statement. Balaam, chapter 24, verse 1. So it pleased the Lord to bless Israel. He did not go, as at other times, to seek to use sorcery. Now, what does that mean? One thing I would think about is the idea, and look at verse 23 in chapter 23, that's kind of been a part of this. That was a part of this pagan aspect of what Balaam was doing. That he was a guy, and sorcery can be incantation, it can be, all these different things. I'd love to spend a little time talking about that. We don't have the time, but I'd love to say, oftentimes I would describe as sorcery a lot of what charismatic churches do, a lot of what denominations that are really big into, their holy gifts do. I would say maybe that some of that is some of this. But the point is that here we have this language about he's going to put aside the sorcery, he's going to try something else. This time he's actually looking, and he gives them the third blessing. Balak is so angry, he strikes his hands together. You have bountifully blessed them these 3 times. He says, get out of here get out of here before I. So, Balaam says it again. He says, I can't do anything God doesn't tell me. And another message from God where he starts talking about these other nations. He talks about what's going to happen with the Moabites. He talks about what's going to happen with the Edomites. He talks about what's going to happen with the Amalekites, the Kenites. He throws it all out there to kind of say, and this is the thing that's going to happen. So not only has he blessed Israel, but he has pronounced woe on these other people. Go ahead, Rob.
I have a question about these 3 places that they went to build the 7 altars. Were these all high places of Baal?
So the first one for sure says it's a high place of Baal. Mount Pisgah is a high place. So, not capital high place, just it's a tall mountain. So it could have been, but doesn't really tell us. Now, the third one is Peor. And Peor, I'll be honest, isn't actually called a mountain. But there is what we're going to meet next week, Baal Peor, which is a shrine or a temple to Baal. So like I said, at least 2 of them are high places are associated with worship of Baal. So
what are they doing with the bulls and the rams and the sacrifices that they're doing? Is he profiting in this way by getting the meat?
I'm sure he paid it. Like I said, he offered silver and gold early on. I think that's got to be what this has been all about. Now, you might be thinking of the idea that among the Israelite priests, they were to receive a portion of what was sacrificed. I don't know that that's what would be happening here.
He said he sent it to him. I don't know exactly what it is now, but said after they did the sacrifice, and they were sending some of it to Baal.
I saw here it was a burnt offering that they were burning up.
But I was just wondering about, because he kept saying you could give me half your silver or gold or whatever, but I can't tell you something different. So I'm wondering where the pay part, or if he had a reputation for being a prophet for profit.
Yeah, profit for profit. That rolls off the tongue nicely. I'm going to say, well, actually, I'll tell you what, Rob, I want to kind of use that as maybe leading into this question here. But one of the interesting things is I don't know exactly, I assume that that Balaam was paid money. We're going to see a statement in the New Testament that hints at that as well. So it's going to talk about the wages he had. So that'll kind of be a key to that too. Stephen, you got a thought on this?
Also, Ron's point, in chapter 24, it seems pretty clear that Balaam is speaking back and forth with Balaam, and we don't really know what he was doing at all because he performed services, and he didn't do it with the honor that Balak had said.
Yeah. So maybe he never got paid. In other words, Stephen, that's a really interesting point. That because he utterly failed, the language here of flee to your place, does indicate that very idea. So it's kind of interesting. Now, let's tell you what, we'll put a pin on any other comment. Let's just kind of grab these questions in the time we have left. Why might God have told him no the first time and yes the second? What do you think? Go ahead, Stephen.
So I think this entire thing was a fool's errand from the beginning at Numbers 22, verse 12, where God said, "You shall not go," period.
Mm-hmm.
Then after that, the men come again. Balaam speaks to God, and he says, he's really angry about the fact that he's come to him again, asking the same question. He says, "Okay, go." The guy's a false prophet. He is being paid for his services. He goes to the Moabites and preaches everything that they don't want to hear. So it's almost a mockery. After verse 12, it's almost a mockery of every single thing they do.
Interesting, Stephen. So the idea that really an exercise in futility, that everything is a mockery, right up to the fact that the donkey is talking to him. And again, I think that's meant to be,
To really emphasize
how foolish it was that the donkey is the only one that said anything sensible this whole time. That really is a striking point. And I think that's a little bit of why this is like that. It's meant to contrast the idea of Balaam's not special because God said this to him, because God even spoke through a donkey. That takes away the specialness of Balaam. So that's a really good point about why God might have refused. Gregor, what do you got?
Well, and Balak listened so well, he says with sarcasm dripping from his voice. I mean, he heard 3 blessings of Israel and he kept saying, well, let's try this place, let's try this. I mean, how many times do you have to hear that Israel is special before you believe it?
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because Balak just seemed to think, well, if we're in the right place, we ought to be able to do this. I think, again, it testifies to Balak's
And he kept looking
paganism.
to Balaam to change something where Balaam kept saying, it's up to God, not me.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting point. I'm going to have to move quickly because we're just about out of time. What do you think God threatened him? Got a couple of interesting points here, and I think Gregor made a comment earlier that was really good too. Grant says early on, he says, I find it interesting that he tells him he can't go, but still tells him to wait until he asks again. That was kind of what I was thinking about as well. Maybe Balaam wants to go, perhaps for the money, is hoping God will say yes if he asks again. One of the things I was thinking about is the idea of maybe it's just this, if I keep pushing this, maybe I can go, that Balaam wants to go. Let's be honest. If you're playing to your ego, you're playing to your greed, it would be hard not to be tempted. Stephen Root made an interesting thing. He says, well, you wonder if some of this might have been about hospitality too, of, just wait here and we'll, get going in the morning. But he says, yeah, money's probably the thing. So that is kind of Grant makes a further analogy. He says, well, it's almost like he has some kind of regular fee, like there was something that they knew they would have to pay, that when they showed up, they knew that's what they had to do. So it might speak again to Balaam's profit for money. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was thinking Samuel could be paid too, so I'm not sure payment for profit necessarily.
Oh, interesting. So Ryan points out that Samuel had gotten paid, and maybe that wasn't exactly, that the labor is worthy of his wages kind of thing. Ryan, I hadn't really thought about that, so that's good. Anybody else have a thought? Gregor's comment earlier was really neat. The idea of if they ask you, go with them, and it doesn't seem like maybe they asked, so that's a really good point there. I tell you what, we'll skip this question. Revelation 2 and verse 14 is next week, so we're going to pass over this. I just want to kind of summarize. So as we kind of wrap this up, I just want to say, why is this important to the New Testament? Well, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 15, Peter is talking about false teachers among Christians. And when he talks about false teachers, he said that they've forsaken the right way and they've gone astray. And he says they are following the path of Balaam. Now, the interesting thing about Balaam is that Balaam, here is Balaam, and he says Balaam loved the wages of unrighteousness. So whatever we want to speculate about Balaam, Balaam loved money. And he was prepared to do all sorts of things for money. Second point is, it also tells us what this speaking donkey was about. He was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. Now, I had a lot of thoughts on the madness of the prophet, thinking about the idea of what money does to somebody. It drives them mad. But Anthony's going to ring the bell. So we'll stop here. Lamar's going to pick up for us next week. Look at that passage in Revelation. It really is an important point for us to consider as we're looking ahead. What was it while they're perhaps on Peor, while they're still making that third sacrifice, that Balaam tells Balak? We can record what it is here, but we find out in the book of Revelation what happened, and that leads you to what's going to happen next week. And that's where we're done. Thanks so much for our online chat, too. We're glad you were here.